Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Next slide. My name is Tendai Waitak. I work at DHS Foster Care Unit, and I will be your presenter today. We're also going to have Eric Kratt from the Minnesota Child Welfare Training Academy, who is going to have a few slides he's going to share with us today. Next slide. Can you go back to slide 2? Thank you. Just want to make sure we provided you guys with some housekeeping information here. You are all going to be not able to unmute yourself, but you'll be able to post questions in the Q&A that we will answer at the end of our presentation today. As you can see on the slide here, there is the check mark in blue is where the Q&A is at the bottom of your Zoom. So if you have a question, please make sure you put it in the Q&A, not in the chat. Next slide. All right, a couple more things about housekeeping here. Slides will be available after the webinar, and this webinar is being recorded for future viewing. So if you want to revisit this webinar or you want to provide this webinar to other people, there's a link on this presentation that you can provide to everybody through the Minnesota Child Welfare Training. So that way you'll be able to kind of review this when you need to. Recordings will be available a week after today. So this is our agenda that you see right here. This is what we're going to walk through today. So just Family First Prevention Services Act, placement and process changes, webinar, our purpose for today's webinar, the Juvenile Treatment Screening Team, some SSIS information, and then also talk about what's next. Then we'll get into answering some questions you may have. Next slide. So we have recorded the Family First Prevention Services Act, FFPSA Placement Process Changes webinar already. This webinar occurred last week on the 5th. So this should be already available on the Minnesota Child Welfare Training link that we have posted here for your viewing. This summer, the Child Safety and Permanency team is hosting a webinar series, and each of these webinars will be recorded for future viewing. If you need to view these, please go to that link. We are doing it this way because we want to make sure that we're not duplicating and repeating information that has already been shared and talked about. For any information about FFPSA and the changes that are coming, please view this webinar. Let's see here. Next slide. So the purpose of our webinar today is to walk through and provide you with the practice standards of the Juvenile Treatment Screening Team process that will be consistent with the amended statute, including the new provisions due to the Family First Prevention Services Act. Something important to note, all these new FFPSA requirements are going to be effective September 30th. So that's when we'll be requiring all of our agencies to follow through with this policy when they're doing the Juvenile Treatment Screening Team process. Next slide. So the Juvenile Treatment Screening Team process itself, it is not a new process. Counties and our initiative tribes have been using this screening for a long time now. So the idea is, in order for a child to receive treatment for an emotional disturbance, developmental disability, or any other related condition in a residential facility that is licensed by DHS or licensed and approved by a tribe, the screening team is the first step when considering this child's entry into a residential facility. This also includes our children entering into voluntary foster care treatment as well, Statute 260D. A juvenile treatment screening team is also utilized to reauthorize placements for a child so they can continue getting residential services. Next slide. So when a juvenile treatment screening team, so when is a juvenile treatment screening team required? It is required when our county agencies have care and placement responsibility of a child. Also when our tribal agency is recommending residential services in a QRTP and they have placement responsibility with the county being financially responsible. Screening is also required when parents request residential services and the placement is not covered by their private insurance. When a mental health professional makes a request or recommends for a child to receive services, the responsible social service agency will make this request to do the screening as well as the juvenile treatment screening team. Also, a juvenile treatment screening team is required when a court orders a child with an emotional disturbance, developmental disability, or any other related condition to enter into a QRTP. This screening is also required when a child is unlikely to return home after being placed in a crisis shelter due to an emotional crisis or emergency, and the agency at that time is exploring placement in a QRTP facility. Next slide. So on the other hand, a screening is not required when agencies are considering placing a child in the new FFPSA specialized settings. This FFPSA specialized settings were reviewed on our webinar that was shown last week on FFPSA changes. But these settings are for youth to get services for prenatal, postpartum, parenting support. Also for youth to get services for youth who have been or are at risk of becoming victims of sex trafficking or commercial exploitation, and for youth who are being considered for placement in a supervised setting for youth who are 18 years old or age, 18 years old of age or older, so that they can live independently. It will be important to note that screenings are not required for a child to be placed in a PRTF, that's a psychiatric residential treatment facility, or when a child needs to be placed immediately in a facility due to an emotional crisis or other mental health emergency. So these are all the settings where a juvenile treatment screening team would not be required for a child to be placed in these settings. Okay. Next slide. A quick note on this issue of the level of care determination. So this is currently, the level of care determination is currently used in the juvenile treatment screening team process. So it is what the juvenile treatment screening team must be provided by the case manager in order to be able to plan for the supports and services during the screening team. So a part of the diagnostic assessment, which is the level of care determination, is that a CASI is usually administered as part of the diagnostic assessment by a treating mental health professional to all children receiving clinical services. So the treating mental health professional should provide agency case managers with a copy of the CASI to ensure that everybody is using the same information as they go through the screening team. Just something to remember, agency case managers are not responsible for completing the CASI if it is for the purposes of eligibility. It is the responsibility of the treating mental health for that child to provide the case manager with this tool. Just want to make sure that we put that out there so everybody can understand. Next slide. So who can request a screening? County or initiative tribe social service agencies may determine their own process for requesting a screening. However, it is common for agency case managers from either children's mental health, child protection, child welfare, developmental disability areas to request this screening. Also, agency case manager may also request a screening on behalf of parent, custodian, guardian. Something to remember about this one, parents, custodian, and guardians can also contact the county or tribal social service agency themselves to make this request. So either the case manager can do it for them if they're already involved in some type of case management with the county or tribe, or they can call in themselves to their county they reside in to make this request. The agency case manager can also make a request on behalf of non-county mental health professionals or any contracted services case managers who are working with that child at that time. Who else can also request a screening? The child's health plan. If the parent, guardian, or custodian, or treatment professional of an enrolled child feels placement in a residential placement program is appropriate. So all these people may ask the health plan to arrange a level of care screening and determination in order to be able to make the request for a screening. All right, next slide. So what are the timelines for screening to be completed by? A screening needs to be done within 15 days of a request. When this request is coming from the agency case manager on behalf of everybody we just talked about, or when it's a request from a parent themselves. So 15 days is the timeline for that. However, if a child is enrolled in a prepaid health program, the screening needs to be completed in 10 days of that request. The timelines are actually current policies, so this is not changed due to FFPSA requirements. Just want to make sure that was clear. Next slide. Okay. So the screening team members. So I have a couple lists on here. The agency will be responsible for assembling the screening team when a request has been made. And the team must include the following individuals. So a parent, guardian, or custodian, county or tribal case manager, persons with expertise in treatment of children who have emotional disturbance, developmental disabilities, or substance abuse disorders. So mental health providers or licensed alcohol and drug counselor, just somebody who has expertise in the treatment of children who have an emotional disturbance or developmental disability, or whatever applies for that child at that time. Also, the screening team must include a designated representative of the Indian child's tribe. Unless tribal authority declines to appoint a representative, so the agency must make rigorous and concerted efforts to make sure that this representative is part of the screening team. If the child is enrolled in a health plan, a representative from the health plan should also be present for the screening team. The next list that you see there with may, and this is if needed or necessary, the team may include the following people. A child who's aged 14 or older can designate 2 representatives that can be part of the screening team if that's what they choose. Relatives that are approved by the child or parents, foster care provider if they are involved in the child's case or if applicable, and professionals who are a resource to the child's family. So that means teachers, medical providers, mental health provider, clergy, or anyone really who is a professional and a resource to the family at that time that will help in making the decision on what services supports the child's needs during the screening team. Just a little note here for us to understand as we talk about who can be included in the screening team. The team will not include a person who is trained and certified to be a qualified individual. A qualified individual is a person who will complete an independent assessment after the screening team makes their recommendation for a child to be placed in a QRTP. This assessment will determine if it's appropriate and necessary for a child to be placed in a QRTP. I know I needed to kind of say that, but I know this is all new information for most of us on here. But I want to let you know that we will be discussing more in depth all the information about the qualified individuals and the QRTP assessment at our next webinar on August 17th from 1 to 3 p.m. I didn't want us to lose kind of what we're talking about here, which is the juvenile treatment screening team. So we will be discussing more on what I just mentioned about the qualified individual QRTP assessment at a later webinar next week on Tuesday. So please register for that. Another quick note here for us to remember, all ICWA and MIFA provisions apply for the juvenile treatment screening team process. So that includes sending a follow-up email after you send the initial notice and inquiry when the child you are working with providing services to, you have reason to believe they are affiliated with a tribe. And this process is not any different. It's not new. This is current policy. So before the responsible social service agency assembles a juvenile treatment screening team, there's now a requirement that you must consult with the child's parents, with the child if they're 14 or older, and if it applies with the child's tribe to obtain recommendations. Next slide. Regarding which, next slide. Sorry about that. So the responsible social service agency assembles the juvenile treatment screening team, and they must consult with the child's parents, a child 14 or older, and if it applies, the tribe, to obtain recommendations regarding which individuals to include on the team to ensure that the team is family-centered and will act in the child's best interest. So what you see here is just some practice consideration in assembling this team. Per statute, if the child or their parents or legal guardians raise concerns about specific relatives or professionals being on the team should not include those individuals. This, however, excludes this excludes a custodial parent who does not want the agency to engage a non-custodial parent when the child's safety issues do not exist. We've also developed some other practice considerations for agencies to consider before they assemble the juvenile treatment screening team. Now, just a side note, all this information that we're talking about today is included in the new juvenile treatment screening team practice guide. I'll provide a link at the end of our webinar today if you have not already reviewed that document. So some of these considerations include things like identifying the child's permanency plan, for the child with the parents and in consultation with the child or tribe, determining if the child is eligible to receive community services, disability waivers, interventions used to kind of prevent placement. A few things to consider, obviously obtaining necessary releases from the parents in order to gather information and review child's relevant documents. So like IEPs or any other documents that will help in the process of doing this juvenile treatment screening team. In most cases, a release of information for tribal participation in the screening team is not required. But if there's questions about this piece, about the need for a release of information from the tribe, please consult with your county attorney on that piece. A couple other practice considerations before assembling the team is making sure we identify a language interpreter for a child or family if that is needed, and just reviewing the funding options and implications with the parents, and considering the mental health and behavioral short and long-term goals for the child. Next slide. So before assembling the team, it may be helpful to prepare the parents, custodians, guardians of the screening process. Once again, this is something that we have included in our juvenile treatment screening team practice guide. It's just some tips for our agencies just to follow as you work through this process with our children and families. So some of these examples are just providing the parents, custodians, and guardians with the screening process, just so they understand what's about to happen, what it's about. Obtaining communication preferences of the family. Once again, making sure that if an interpreter is needed, that's reviewed and that it will be provided. And discussing with the parents the importance of engagement in the screening process, whether it will be participating in the screening team in person or via phone or virtual. If the parent is not able to be present, who will be able to answer any questions that may come up. So these are all the things that can help prepare the parents for the juvenile treatment screening team. And like I mentioned before, more detailed examples of these consideration of tips to follow when to prepare parents and guardians about the screening team. Those are included in our juvenile treatment screening team practice guide as well. Next slide. Okay. Considerations for QRTP. So if the agency is looking into or considering placing the child in a QRTP, these are just some considerations to look into while the juvenile treatment screening team process is going. And we have developed what the team may consider, and this includes things like, as you can see here, child's current eligibility for children's mental health or developmental disability case management. The child's behavior, is the child's behavior or mental health managed? It's a good question to consider and ask ourselves. Is the child safe in their home or other supervised settings, as in like a family foster home, when receiving community-based interventions or services? What supports are available to the child at that time? What supports or services are in place to strengthen the family? And any cultural connections that are preserved that would help the child be able to kind of, get these services either in their home or, family foster home. And the child's mental and behavioral health and short-term goals. Another thing the screening team is to consider when thinking about placing a child in a QRTP is what were the agencies or the parents' efforts to prevent placement, or what services, interventions to prevent placement in a foster home or QRTP were looked into, anything like that. So this includes things like positive support services, wraparound, respite, in-home services for the child and family support, school supports and accommodations. So we just want to make sure it's a rounded process being made in figuring out what the agency efforts were to make sure that this child maybe can get services at home, or if they do need to be placed in a QRTP. It will be also important to consider prior residential placements and outcomes for the particular child. Permanency goals will be important to consider. So this is identifying what will support reunification and what will not, relative searches and engagement to support this permanency planning, and just identifying relatives who can support or meet child's treatment needs and service access. Also, the team should consider description of how placement, in a QRTP is the least restrictive setting and how it will support the goal of improving the child's functioning. So I want to make sure that we provided this in the new practice, juvenile treatment screening team practice guide, and it's laid out in detail in that document as well. A couple of things also to consider as you are looking into a QRTP placement for the child while in the screening team is if the child is currently experiencing any emotional crisis or other mental health emergencies, if the child is posing any imminent risk of physical harm to self or others, as these will determine if this child needs to be placed in as an emergency in a crisis shelter or anything like that. Positive support strategies and services or less restrictive measures that have not been tried that will maintain child safely in their home or a foster home. Next slide. So as the juvenile treatment screening team process winds down, and when the agency has placement responsibility or plans to offer a voluntary placement agreement for a child to be placed, the juvenile treatment screening team, if the juvenile treatment screening team recommends placing a child in a QRTP at the end of their process, the agency must notify the parents, custodians, and the child's tribe the recommendation, including what happens next after that recommendation is determined. So this means providing information about the role of the qualified individual in completing the QRTP assessment. As I mentioned earlier, qualified individual will be the person who completes an independent assessment to determine whether it's necessary and appropriate for this particular child to be placed in a QRTP that's been recommended by the juvenile treatment screening team. For more, and we will talk more about this on August 17th. Like I said earlier, we'll have a 2-hour webinar on that, and we'll be able to answer all your questions about this new FFPSA process of the qualified individual and the QRTP assessment. So on top of notifying the parents about the recommendation and the subsequent assessment, another thing that the agency must do is begin this QRTP assessment process without delay. So that is referring that child to the identified qualified individual at that time and starting the assessment process. Another must for our agencies to do when you recommend a QRTP in the juvenile treatment screening team, also you need to conduct a relative search in order to assemble the child's family and permanency team. That term may be new to everybody here, the child's family and permanency team. Like I said earlier, we are offering a webinar series where we are going to talk about what is a family and permanency team and why agencies will be needing to assemble this team. In our upcoming family and permanency team's role in the QRTP placement. This webinar will be on September 2nd from 1 to 2 p.m. So please also register for that. If the child being recommended for QRTP is an Indian child, the agency must ensure due diligence in applying our ICHO and MIPRA provisions and following out the order of placement preferences of the Indian Child Welfare Act. That has not changed. Next slide. So the screening team is either going to recommend placement in a QRTP or it's not going to recommend placement in a QRTP. There actually would be recommending either the child remain in their family home, family foster home, or other setting. So when the juvenile treatment screening team does not recommend placement in a QRTP, they would need to document what the services and supports are going to be if they're recommending the child to remain in the home, for the child to remain enter a family foster home, or for the child to be placed in any other setting. So any other setting includes those specialized settings that we talked about, whether it's for pregnant and parenting youth, our youth who are or have been sexually trafficked or commercial exploitation, or our 18 and older independent living settings. So you would have to document in the screening team what the services and supports would be for each one of those. And I'll just repeat that. You're only documenting for one of these options, depending on what your final recommendation, what the final recommendation of the juvenile treatment is. Another part of after you have determined that after the screening team does not recommend a QRTP, the agency will also then consult and discuss with the parents, custodians, guardians, next steps to arrange and access these services and supports that were identified by the screening team, and planning for the child to return home or be placed in a foster home, any other setting. So the last two slides were really what is new about, part of what is new about the juvenile treatment screening team policy, that the team either recommends placement in a QRTP or recommends for child to remain home, be in a foster home, or enter into all the other specialized settings. Next slide. All right, so if the team determines child's needs do not require treatment in a QRTP, the agency must inform the parent, parents, custodian, or guardians of the applicable appeals rights for that process. The county or tribal caseworkers may assist parents in figuring out this process and filing an appeal as needed. Also on that note, if the health plan declines placement in a QRTP, the parent may also file an appeal with that health plan at that time. And this electronic document here, DHS 32104, can walk a parent through on how to make a request for a fair state hearing. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, all the information I've gone through today is included in the Juvenile Treatment Screening Team Practice Guide. And this practice guide is located on our county website link. When you registered for this webinar, it was the document that was titled Handout. So if you want to go back there and pull it up that way, or if you want to pull it out through here, you can most certainly find it that way. So if there's any questions about that, you can also email us. Okay, next slide. All right. So as part of the new implementation of FFPSA requirements effective September 30th, 2021, caseworkers will now be required to complete a new juvenile treatment screening team screen in SSIS. And this is located under the permanency node. And this new screen is for agency workers to document the screening process, recommendations, services and supports that are being recommended, and everything really that was done as part of the screening process. And to kind of walk us through what this new screen looks like, I'm going to have Eric Kratt walk us through this and its location in SSIS. Eric, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. This is Eric with the SSIS training team. Glad to be here. I'm seeing the Q&A populate with a lot of questions, so I will try to make it through this part of our demonstration today as quickly and painlessly as possible. I just wanted to preface this discussion also with the fact that we were going to follow up this policy webinar with an SSIS coffee talk this afternoon to go into more of a detailed overview of screen functionality as we walk through SSIS, but unfortunately, due to a special build that was deployed yesterday, the screen lost focus and kind of broke. So we are now going to postpone that webinar to Thursday, August 19th at 2:30. And we've tried to contact all of our marketing streams, SSIS update, SSIS mentor blast, and then something will be sent out from the Training Academy about that schedule change. You may or may not have already received that email from Zoom, but if you are already registered for that SSIS coffee talk, there's nothing you need to do. The link will still work for the postponed webinar that we will air next Thursday, August 19th at 2:30. All right, feel free to proceed to the next slide. Okay, so the Juvenile Treatment Screening Team subfolder is under the participant node and under the permanency folder. And I just want to make a side note here that multiple juvenile treatment screening team records may be created over time for a client. For purposes of our webinar today and in the job aid itself that I've posted in the chat, I've broken up the screen into 3 pieces. The first piece is the initial entry and juvenile screening team decision. And then we'll talk about the if denied portion of the screen, as well as if accepted. Feel free to, let me just say that the new juvenile treatment screening team screen can be created next to the juvenile treatment screening team folder under the permanency folder. Okay, you can proceed to the next slide. So this is the initial entry section of the juvenile treatment screening team. And as you can see, there are a few required fields in the beginning. We have at the top, at the very top of the screen, we have juvenile treatment screening team help text. So when you click on that blue underlined link, it's going to give you some statute related information, as well as some functionality for this juvenile treatment screening team screen. Then we move on to the second field there, which is the date that the screening was requested. And then we have the case manager that is requesting the screening field, and that will include a drop down of agency staff, your agency staff. And then we have a field that is titled initially requested by, and you're going to enter the entity that originally requested the screening. And there are several items to choose from in that drop down. If the initially requested by field is populated with either tribal, social services, or county social service case manager, then the next field, case manager program area, will enable. And you will select from the program area, including child protective services, children's mental health, disability services, etc. It's all listed there in the job aid. And then finally, we have the buttons accepted or denied. So that is where we are going to put the request next to request status. Again, these are radio buttons where workers will select whether the request for screening was either accepted or denied. Now, when the individual selects denied, then the if denied portion of the screen will enable. So you can proceed to the next slide. This is the if denied section of the new screen in SSIS. I like to say things are pretty self-explanatory, but I'm just going to go over the fields that you see before you. You have a list of the denial reasons, and you're going to check all that apply. So you're going to see a box designated for diagnostic assessment is not current, or licensed clinician is not recommending residential treatment, or other. When an individual selects other, they're going to describe other denial reasons in the text field that you see below. Once this information is entered, a shortcut has been created on this screen to create the notice of social service action, where the worker is going to create that document called notice of social service action and list the denial reasons in that document. Now, if the juvenile treatment screening team accepts, then the if accepted portion of the SSIS screen will enable. And I don't know if I have the greatest screenshot for you, but if we navigate to the next slide, you'll see what the if accepted portion looks like. At the top here, we have ICWA. In the dropdown, you'll see a list of one or more ICWA eligibility determinations, and you're going to choose the top option for the latest eligibility determination for ICWA and MIFPA. And then right next to that field, you're going to see an index card, and that index card is going to list ICWA eligibility information as kind of a shortcut so that you don't have to navigate back to the ICWA folder. And if yes, ICWA applies, we're going to go to this next field and we're going to document the rigorous and concerted efforts made to include a designated representative of the Indian child's tribe on the the Juvenile Treatment Screening Team. The next field is the date that the screening was completed. Then following the date screening completed, we have an editable grid where individuals are going to, where the worker is going to build a list of screening team members. Off to the left-hand side of that editable grid is participants. So you'll be able to select under this participant field any of the professional collaterals, or participants that are entered in under the particular work group that you're working from. Then the next column over, we have the social services agency staff. You'll be able to pull particular staff from your agency into that field. Or you can just manually type the name into the next field if the individual is neither a participant or a social services agency staff. There is a shortcut. If you peer up to kind of the top right of that grid, you'll see a button that says add participants. And when you select add participants, you're going to be taken to a screen where you can add collateral or professional collateral information. These individuals that you add under the add participants button will not be added to participants or collaterals under the work group, but they'll be available to select under your participants column in the future when you are building your list of juvenile treatment screening team. I hope that made sense. After or type name, you would select the relationship of that particular participant or social service agency staff. You can include the child in your juvenile treatment screening team. So one of the selections under relationship is child or youth. And again, we'll go into more detail about all of the options in our SSIS Coffee Talk rescheduled for next Thursday. Then we have the case manager program area. So if you choose a social service agency staff, then you're going to choose the manager program area in that dropdown. And then I see that we have a field for notified, and we're going to select yes or no if they were notified. And then I think something got cut off on my screenshot here. So I'm definitely going to have this updated for next week, and I'll have to look into it. But there's also supposed to be a field for attended. And then under attended, you would also select yes or no. And then the next text field down, we have how was information about the juvenile screening team shared with the child? You would document that information. If a child is age 14 or older, did the agency ask if they wanted representatives on the screening team? You can select from yes or no indicators. And then another wonky thing on our screen here is that the selections under this next section where it says agency efforts to engage parents, guardians, and custodians, check all that apply. It appears grayed out on my screenshot here, and that's what I mean by lost focus during that special build yesterday, but those will be active when this screen is corrected. So there will be a list of checkboxes that an agency staff person can select from under this field. And then if there were other that is not included in this list, there is a text field that is also appearing grayed out on my screenshot here, but the agency will document other efforts used to engage the parents, guardians, and custodians. Then we have the placement recommendations. And we're going to select whether a placement is denied, recommended, or recommended for qualified residential treatment program. And then we have, if recommended, was a referral to a qualified individual made? You're going to select yes or no. And if the child's needs do not require treatment in a qualified residential treatment program, the team recommends child to, and we covered this earlier, but the options will be remain at home, placed in a family foster home, or placed in any other setting. And then we're going to document services and supports for the recommended setting under the final field. Another thing on my screenshot that's a little wonky here is the create notice of social service action button will also be activated under the if accepted portion of the screen, and workers can create the notice of social service action when the screening team determines that the youth doesn't need to be placed in a qualified residential treatment facility. So they'll create the notice of social service action from this portion to explain that in the notice of social service action. And I think that pretty much covers the new screen in SSIS. I know that was kind of a high level overview, but again, reference that job aid that I put in the chat for you. And then again, I'll say it one more time. We did reschedule that more in-depth exploration of the screen for next Thursday, August 19th. And I'm going to hand it back over to you, Tende.
Thank you, Eric. Okay. Eric, there was another slide about the social service action. This is the one you were just talking about?
Yes, I just added that. This is just an image of that notice of social service action and where it's located under chronology documents. And that shortcut from the juvenile treatment screening team screen will bring you to the work group and chronology so that you're able to create this document.
Thank you. And like Eric said, there's going to be opportunities to be able to walk through all this new information. Definitely the new SSIS screen, as this is a completely new function in SSIS that will be requiring our agencies to complete now. So there'll be opportunities to work through this before everything goes live September 30th. Next slide. And the next step here is just what's next. So everybody's kind of aware that this is not going to be just a one-time thing. Like I said earlier, all of our webinars, the two that have gone so far, one last week and this one today, and this is our list of what's to come up until September 28th of all the new FFPSA requirements. And like I said earlier, everything will be recorded and these can be viewed at any point in time that you need to review any of this information. There will be documents posted for each one of these webinars, including bulletins and practice guides that are currently being developed. So you have all this information on hand before implementation, for when implementation starts. So, and registration for all of these can be found on our County Link website as well, where you registered for this webinar. And next slide. And this is what Eric was talking about. This has been rescheduled for next Thursday, correct?
Yep. So this link, I just put this link in the chat for everyone, and it lists out all of the upcoming policy webinars as well as the SSIS coffee talks. And then the link that's listed for the juvenile treatment screening team under August 12th will still allow you to register for August 19th. And it says August 19th now, so it's been updated and corrected.
Yes. All right. I did check the Minnesota Child Welfare Academy training, and the webinar for the FFPSA and its impact is up and running if you need to review that, just so you are aware. Next slide. right. And this is our questions portion. We do have 8 minutes left to the webinar. We were hoping to have more time than that to go over the questions, but I know that we will have all the questions saved, so we can, if we're not able to go through all of them today or some, have a Q&A that can then be sent out to our attendees today and also be posted as part of the handouts for this webinar. So if we're not able to answer them today, that's what we're going to be doing.
Tendai, this is Deb
Yeah.
Besky Brown, and I will just note that there's several questions in the chat or the Q&A regarding the difference between the screening team that is referenced in the Children's Mental Health Act and the screening team that is in 260C. I did answer a couple of the questions, just clarifying statute, but can you talk a little bit about, I think some of the questions would be, how does the appropriate level of care, you're talking about a juvenile treatment screening team, is that the team that determines the appropriate level of care for the child? Something we're doing right now. There's another question here regarding the process for the juvenile treatment screening team when there is not a diagnostic. So maybe just address that a little bit.
Okay, so the first question here was, when you're talking about this juvenile treatment screening team, is it the team that determines the appropriate level of care for a child? Is this something we are doing right now? Yes, the juvenile treatment screening team process is something that is already being used by counties and tribes to consider as a first step to consider a child being placed in a residential treatment program. So the concept of the screening team itself is not a new process. So this is something that's already being done right now within your counties and tribal agencies. See here. What was that second question, Deb? Deb, can you hear me? What was that second question?
Sorry, I was talking while I was muted.
That's okay.
The second question was if a diagnostic is required to be to have a juvenile treatment screening team meeting.
Yes. So the diagnostic assessment determines the level of care treatment, and the level of care is required to be provided to the juvenile treatment screening team, so they can then do their part in figuring out what recommendation for the child will be, so they can be informed or what the plan and services and supports will be for that child. So yes, it is required. If it's not done, there's going to be a new screen in SSIS that the screening request may be denied if that portion is not done. So the screening team will go back to the case manager and request that be either, if possible, that may be done within the screening team. If there is a mental health professional as part of the team, if the child's treating mental health professional didn't do it themselves. So there's ways that will be able to be completed. But in having done our work group on the juvenile treatment screening team, it had been determined that at times the screening team may deny a request if the diagnostic assessment is not completed. So they would go back to the agency and with the worker and work through to figure out how they can get that done, so the screening team can be done for that particular child. Anything you want to add, Deb, to that?
Yeah, I would just add that a mental health professional is not required, to my knowledge, to be on the juvenile treatment screening team. And
Mhm.
some children you may be looking at to be screened, their needs may not be directly related to a mental health diagnosis. They may have other needs. So in that, you may not necessarily have a mental health diagnostic completed on that child, but you may have other information from other medical professionals that's leading you to that discussion. And I will just also add that the level of care requirement in the Mental Health Act in 245A certainly allows the diagnostic information to be shared for the juvenile treatment screening team that is part of 260C.
And it looks like we have 2 minutes left here. I am thinking we are going to get all the questions that are in the Q&A and be able to answer them in detail, so we don't have to rush through it right now. And we'll be able to provide them to our participants today and add it as a handout under the recorded webinar for future viewing as well.
I have copied the Q&A to a live document, and I will
Great.
also copy the questions from the chat so that we have that on hand.
Awesome. Even the answered ones as well, answered questions?
Yes, yep.
All right, great. Thank you. Just wanted to say thank you everyone for attending our webinar today on the juvenile treatment screening team. Like I said, we'll do our best to answer all the questions that you had today and that may be coming moving forward. And we'll be providing all the responses to our attendees today as soon as we can. Let's see here. Like I said, this webinar is available for viewing a week from today from the Minnesota Child Welfare Training Academy. I have included our email here if you have questions, and we'll be able to answer you if you email them to that address. We have one of us looking at that email every day of the week, so we'll be able to answer you right away. So once again, thank you again for attending today, and we will see you next Thursday for the qualified individual QRTP assessment webinar.
Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.